Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our audience from all over the world. Greetings from the headquarters of the UN System Staff College in Turin. The Staff College is the center of excellence for learning and training for the entire UN system. Today, together with the Vittorio Dan Segre Foundation, we are honored to welcome you to the Unity in Difference virtual event, part of a UNSSE Thought Leadership Series. Last March, we looked at women's empowerment and gender equality, and today's event focuses on diversity, inclusion, and identity. Within societies and as the United Nations, we need to promote a renewed conversation on identity, one that goes beyond the current mainstream confrontational culture. At UNSSE, we believe that diversity and inclusion are important aspects of a learning culture. Events like these can serve as a reminder to embrace our different identities and work collaboratively. We are privileged to be hosting a panel of distinguished and accomplished leaders. And we are excited that many of you are following the live stream on our YouTube channel. We hope that today's session will be a space for advancing a better understanding of the many aspects of identity. Please follow the conversation and share what you think on social media using the hashtag #UnityInDifference. Now, let me introduce the panelists. They do not just reflect a range of identities, they are all scholars of identity. My first panelist is Laura Thompson. Laura is the former Deputy Director General of the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Costa Rica to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva. The second panelist is Shireen Dotson. Shireen is the United Nations Ombudsman, Ombudsperson, Ombudswoman. In her role, she facilitates the informal resolution of concerns of UN employees. Prior to her appointment, she was the first full-time ombudsman of the State Department of the United States. And before that, she was a special assistant to the director in the Office of Civil Rights for the State Department of the United States. Third panelist, George Papandreou, former Prime Minister of Greece from 2009-2011, and currently Member of Parliament with the Movement of Change, a coalition of Greek progressive parties. Our fourth panel member is Colette Avital. Colette is an Israeli diplomat and politician. In 2007, she was the first ever woman candidate for Israeli presidency. She's also a board member at the Mitfim Institute, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policy. She's also a member of the Vittorio Segre Foundation. I have to give special thanks to Colette because she accepted our invitation last minute to join this panel. I also wanted to inform all of you that regrettably, Torayo Obeid and Aisha Mindandu are not able to join us today due to personal emergencies. So now, I think the way this panel is going to go is that this is a conversation. So basically, we don't really have any presentations already written or anything. So we would like to have a very informal, direct conversation among the panelists that actually have spent years thinking about the issue, but also professionally dealing with the issue of identities. So it's a very free flow conversation. But before we start that, I would like to ask my partner and co-sponsor of this event, Gabriel Segre, for a few words of opening remarks. Over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Jafar, and thank you to the United Nations Systems Staff College for wanting to and believing into organizing this event and this opportunity to talk about identities and try to talk about identities in a little bit of a different way compared to what we do usually in our politics and as well in the cultural framework of our societies. Let me thank the panelists, our guests, and our scholars on identities for what is going to be in a few seconds a lively conversation about the topic. And what we are going to try to do today is basically consider, think, understand, and imagine what a culture of coexistence of identity, what a new culture of relationship and a new narrative among on the relationship among different entities can look like. One which is not confrontational, one which is not polarizing and leading to conflict, one that is not simplifying the understanding of what we mean by identity. And in order to do that, in order to ask ourselves what traits a new narrative on identity can have and should have, and we need to first grasp what do we mean by identity. There is no conversation about the challenges in our society, in our culture, among the different identities that is pointing and encompassing enough if this doesn't start by understanding what do we mean by identities. So just in a few words, let me tell you in what kind of framework are we going to create this conversation today. What do we mean by identities? Identities is everything that defines us. And identities are multiple and are complex matters for each individual, just as much as each community, each organization, each society. When we talk about identities, we are used to think of us as one. I am of one religion versus you of another religion. I am of one ethnicity versus you of another ethnicity. But we tend to forget, we tend to not consider that every individual has multiple identities. So this is the first character of identities. I myself am many things. I am an Italian, but I'm also an Israeli. I have a religion. I'm a Jew. I'm a person with a disability. I have a gender. I am a male. I am heterosexual. I have my political beliefs. And I can go on all day or night, depending where you are, saying about my many identities. And this is true for all of us. So when we think about identity, we cannot avoid considering the fact that we are not just one thing. And like us, nobody is just one thing. We are many things coming all together. And identities change. They're not a static element. They change over time and over space. I myself am here as a scholar of identity right now, but when I'm dealing with my parents, I'm a son. And when I'm dealing with my teachers, I'm a student, and so on and so forth. And now I am of a younger generation, and in a few years, my identity, my age identity will change, and this is true for all my identities. So identities are multiple, identities are dynamic, but identities are also performative. What do we mean by performative? Identities need to have some sort of recognition. Identities are not an inherent or a natural biological and necessarily biological element or a trait of our personality and of our being, but they have to be socially recognized, or they are socially recognized. So if I am sitting on a desert island, like in the one in the comics with the palm tree, and I'm alone, who cares what identities I have? Nobody's going to recognize them, and I'm not going to be able to perform any of them vis-a-vis somebody else. So the performance of the identity requires always some other, some social relationship. So on the basis of this understanding of the multiplicity of the nature of identities, the dynamicity, the fact that they are dynamic, the change over space and time, and the performativity of identity, on this very basis, we want to try to start a conversation and trying to bring perspectives from our panelists on their own many multiple changing identities, as well as the ones that they have observed and they observe every day in their leadership and activist roles. Back to you, Jafar.
Thank you very much, Gabby, for a very brief definition of the concept of identity. I think it's very clear what we mean and why we're having this panel today. Now, let me go to Laura. Laura, who are you? Can you describe yourself on the basis of your multiple identities and how you navigate them in your daily life? Also, if you can take the concept and apply to your experience, whether it's been in the UN, in IOM, dealing with these issues, very difficult issues, migration and migrants coming with already built-in identities who have to develop new identities in the new settings. How did you deal with it? But first, who are you? What are your identities? Over to you.
Thank you, Jafar, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. I am really excited because it's indeed a very interesting and touching, I would say, and very actual subject at this point. Well, I do have indeed a multiple variety of identities. I will describe myself as a citizen of the world, first of all, a woman, a Latin American, but I am also an intellectual, a sports person, a role model for some, a very unconventional woman, an out of the box thinker. But as Gabriel was saying, I have a variety of social identities as well. I am a sister, I am a daughter, I am a partner of somebody. I am a migrant, an expat, as they say, in this side of the world. I am a humanitarian, an international servant, a UN staff, somebody that has served all my life in the UN. And I fully agree with Gabriel that these multiple identities keep changing throughout our lives. I think the fact that I have had an international career and I have made all my adult life in Europe, outside of my country, Costa Rica, has created the person that I am today. That is a different person than the one that left Costa Rica several years ago. So one thing that I think is extremely important is that people are sometimes very attached to what they feel is their own identity. And I think one very important element is to try to not mix what you are with what the identities, the multiple identities that you have, because they change. And these changes can affect who you believe you are at some point. And I think that's one element. The other element is that identities are very often perceived to be an element of separation from others. And I try to look at identities as a way to unify with others. because at the same time, I do understand that identities sometimes separate you from others. But basically, what I feel very much is what brings us together. I mean, Shireen and I work for the UN. Jaffer, you and I work for the UN. So that brings us together. The fact that we meet in a place already makes that, I would say, familiarity that like the psychologists talk about. We are, Colette and Shireen and I, we are women. So we have several things in common that we share. That doesn't mean that we are separate from you or the others that are men, but we do have some things that we share and that are important for us, and where we can very much connect with very easily, I would say. Now, with regard to the migrants, I think it's a very important question, because obviously migration brings the issue of identity in its core. The fact that you leave your country already forces you to negotiate in a certain way your identity. And those of us that have left our countries know that perfectly well. You have to adapt to a new culture, you have to a new place, change in a certain way your uses and your customs, and bring new behaviors into your life. Now, obviously, when you travel like I did and several of us have done in a regular way, when you migrate because you are looking for new job opportunities or studying or you are following your family, you have specific conditions that facilitate in a certain manner that adaptation. You still have to go through a process, but facilitate that adaptation and that renewal of your identity. When you do it in a irregular manner because of forced migration, either because of conflict or natural disaster or war, obviously the shock is much bigger, and that brings people to very difficult psychological moments. I have seen through my years in the International Organization for Migration how difficult it is for people to adapt themselves and to be received and perceived by the new society as part of them. And you see it in the news all the time when they talk about migration, like the problem, one of the biggest problems of the 21st century. Whereas in reality, it brings also a lot of new opportunities. But certainly migrants are one of those that need to constantly renegotiate their own identities, to the point that some of them have to actually get rid of their identity at all, and even hide their own identity in order to be accepted in the new society. So it's a very complex process of readaptation that they pass through.
Thank you, Laura. Let me go now to Shireen. We know who Shireen Dodson is, but who is Shireen Dodson? And also, in your work, you have to deal with clashes of identities, people not respecting each other's identities. How do you deal with it? How's been your experience in this? But first, who are you?
That's a good question. And I've been thinking about that a lot once I got this invitation. So thank you very much for inviting me. You know, I've realized that I show different sides of my identity depending on where I am. Clearly, when you look at me, you see an African-American woman. And so that is an identity that you can never escape, even if you wanted to. But it depends. I thought a lot, it depends on the circumstances. You know, in the UN, which is very hierarchical, you tend to want to say you're an assistant secretary general, because that means something in the UN. Any place else I go, I never say I'm an assistant secretary general. And like Laura, you have those social identities. I'm a mother, I'm a friend, and those two identities are very important to me. I'm an art enthusiast. I'm an author. I have a couple of books, and I don't talk about that generally. And I realized over the Thanksgiving holiday, I'm the matriarch of my family now. That was a real, like, awakening. That, you know, my parents are deceased and my siblings are looking up to me as the matriarch. That was a hard identity to take on, if you will. So we are multifaceted. I think as, I speak for me as a woman, it shifts depending on where you are, what identity you're putting forward. In this, I'm a woman of faith. So there are lots of layers to my identity. And I think that the very eclectic and diverse career that I've had has really helped me in the role as a conflict resolution officer, because you understand the different identities and different perspectives that people are bringing to the table. And you're right, underlying almost every interpersonal conflict is something around identity, whether it's tribalism, if you will, feminism, you know, any of the isms, but there are, and it's our job in informal resolution to help people see things from the other person's perspective. We're not trying to change, but bring understanding. Bring understanding. And once people can see things from another person's perspective, you open the door to resolution of ideas and resolution of some of the conflicts. So identity is critical to who we are as human beings, who we are in learning to accept and understand each other. But I think it's really important that we understand our own identities and not try to focus just on one or two, but dig deeper and really understand all the identities that have shaped us. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Shireen. Now I go to George Papandreou. Of course, we know who you are. I know the name for 2 decades at least, if not more, as a Greek politician and a former prime minister. But can you describe yourself on the basis of your multiple identities, who you are? And also if you can talk a little bit about your leadership roles and efforts. You spend years and years working in Greece, in European Union, dealing with issues, the Balkans, the relationship between Greece and Turkey, and the negotiations with the EU and so forth, and all these very serious, critical situations of negotiations. What role did you observe being played by identities? And how identities are such critical pieces of puzzles? Over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Jafar, and thank you for this very interesting conversation. And I try to be from my personal experiences. Of course, as you mentioned, my one identity, you know, of course, is politician. But as others have said, Laura and Shireen, and Gabriel, of course, we are multiple identities, and that has shaped us. And I think we need to revel in that. I grew up in first few years of my life in California as a young white boy. I knew I was different, however, because our name was not Americanized, as many migrants were forced, as Laura said, to become American, you know. And so Papandreou was a very funny name to pronounce in school. And so I knew I was Greek, and that was my ethnic identity. And in the 60s, when there was a big movement of Black is beautiful, there was sort of a side movement of ethnic is beautiful also, so being proud to be Greek. My father Greek, my mother from Chicago though, and she has Scottish and Swiss background. So I also grew up with Heidi and my learning, you know, my sort of book learning by the bed. My mother is 97, 98 now, I think, and a strong feminist. So I grew up as a feminist also, and with great respect for women, and very shocked, of course, by what's has been revealed with the Me Too movement, because it was out of my reality. From my father's side, he is, of course, Greek. He was Greek, but he also had a Polish grandfather who was a refugee from Lithuania, went to Siberia as a prisoner, finally made it down to Greece during the Ottoman Empire. But my father and my grandfather and myself, we all were refugees at many times or sometimes in our life, basically fighting for justice and democracy. So I've been identified both with a fight for these principles of democracy and freedom, but also as a refugee and living as a refugee. And I lived in Sweden and in Canada as a refugee. But I also realized how my identity was contextualized, because in the US, I was white. When I went to Sweden, somebody attacked me in the street, although it's rare, but attacked me in the street, calling me a black skull. So I said, okay, this is very contextual. I had black hair then, so it doesn't look like I am. And I had hair, but anyway, that just gave me a very different perspective of how contextual also identities can be. I also struggled, who I am. Finally I am, but I think what is very important for me is to accept all these multiple identities and many more, of course, playing guitar or whatever else, loving rock music, and also being able to make a conscious choice of what you really want to be. So being Greek was not simply a destiny, it was more a choice that I came back to Greece and got into politics. So just some ideas and some thoughts on how this has helped me, and also how it has developed, was useful in this region and in Europe and in the Balkans and Greek-Turkish relations. Of course, on a personal level, as I said, there are multiple influences, experiences, and contexts. And I think, as Gabriela said, it's a very interactive, being who you are is a very interactive issue. It also often depends on context. I had multiple experiences in many different schools, many different cultures, that pushed me in a way to try to understand the other, but also try to understand what is common, and to find also the part of identity which could allow me to communicate with the other. But it also pushed me to see that identity is also an ongoing adventure of exploration for yourself, but also of learning from the other. And it's also something that, if you really want to build a sense of commonality, it needs a sense of empathy, security about your own identity, but also empathy towards the fellow human being and who he or she is. And I think that's very much what Gabriela is talking about when he talks about convivencia. I think we need to see how we can create societies which are an ecosystem of security and self-confidence that allows for this exploration, this open exploration of our identities and others' identities, and avoids labeling and profiling, stereotyping, or preconceptions. And of course, in times of insecurity, and we do have times of insecurity today, it's often more difficult, and it often allows more authoritarian figures to try to define us through a monoculture, saying, this is what it is to be Greek, this is what it is to be Hungarian, this is what it is to be whatever. And of course, social media also has played an important role. A whole topic we need to discuss, which often tries to force us into our own group and highlights one aspect of our identity, conformity to a certain group, and often confrontation with other groups. If I have a little time, I can tell you a little bit how I see this in the context of the regional conflicts we've had: Greece, Turkey, the Balkans, the European Union. But you just tell me, Jafar, if you think I want to say a few words about that. Okay. Well, first of all, our identities are, of course, informed by our histories, and our histories are informed by our narratives. And narratives do help us understand our world. That's why we have narratives. But they also can trap us into stereotypes and past conflicts. So that, I think, is one aspect I think we need to think of around history. Secondly, in Greek-Turkish relations, where we had really a conflictual relationship, when I was foreign minister, there was a big earthquake in Turkey. I called for humanitarian help towards Turkey, and there was a huge, massive positive response from Greek citizens, and that developed into a citizens' diplomacy. People getting together, and really that broke down a lot of stereotypes, and we could see, I think this is very important in breaking down the stereotype of identity, people-to-people contact. I think also we need to recognize wounds, but not hide them. Recognize fears, don't try to cover them up, but not be captured by them. Being able to see if we can move forward in a different way, in a different world. And I think this also goes to education. When I was Minister of Education, I did a study with UNESCO in 3 countries, Greece, Turkey, and Bulgaria, on history books. And the result was we all have the same history, and the history just simply says we blame the other. That's what we have in common. So I think we need to teach, not blame, but teach the conflict, teach the different sides, because that's what our lives are. We do have conflicts, we do have differences, but we should be able to learn to live with them in a peaceful way and understand others and others' identities and others' lives and others' histories. Further, I think is important in the region is in identity politics, is to change the context. If we in the Balkans, if we're just alone and just look at our histories, we often reproduce our histories and reproduce our conflicts. However, if we change the context and say, okay, we are actually going to move into this family of the European Union. Now, what is that? That's a family of values, of different values, which can be common: democracy, human rights, minority rights, good neighborly relations. So therefore, we create a common purpose, which allows for different identities, but supersedes these also and allows for a commonality of values. And this is creating a regional idea of peace, of cooperation, but also using other methods: sport, culture, cooking, TV programs, tourism. All that really helped in Greek-Turkish relations. These very simple things, but very human things and very important things. Well, sport, of course, we have the Olympic Games. That was the whole purpose in one way of the Olympic Games, is to bring people together in peaceful competition and highlight the excellence of human beings. But also look at history and see in our histories, we have bright examples of cooperation and bridging beyond conflict. And I think that's very important too, not just to highlight the negatives, but also look at the positives. And even where we have conflicts or differences, we need to find ways to build trust. We can have different views, but also build trust. I think there's another important issue as far as leadership is concerned and public discourse. When we were facing the financial crisis in Greece and I was prime minister, a lot of people, a lot of media and politicians in other parts of Europe were saying, yeah, the Greeks are lazy. Actually, we work more hours than anyone else in Europe, according to the OECD. But this was a stereotyping, and this really hurt. And that, I think, also brings me to an ancient concept of themos, which is the dignity. Gabriele talks a lot about this. The idea that we really need to respect the dignity of our fellow human beings, whoever he or she may be. And when that is hurt, that can create conflict, and that can create discourse, disunity. So how do we move away and really get into this culture of conviviality and convivencia? I think is also linked to really respecting the dignity of your fellow human being. One final point: identity, of course, is one of the issues, one of the big political issues in our times. But there are also underlying real issues too, which inform or affect what our identity is or how we feel about our identity. Issues of inequality, issues of injustice, issues of racism, violence, poverty, corruption, authoritarianism. These are issues that very much will inform how we feel, first of all, our dignity is, but also how we feel that our identity is. As I think Shireen was saying, we do have a DNA of community instinct, but that also creates a sense of insider and outsider. How do we create in this world both a dignity, not only for the insider, but also dignity for the outsider? I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Really appreciate it. Now, let me go to Colette. I know some of your identities: Israeli, Romanian origin, politician, activist, first contender to become the Israeli president, but I'm sure there are more than that. So if you can also describe yourself, who you are, and also talk a little bit about your own experience. You live, you work in the Middle East, which is, I have to say, this issue of identities is really problematic there. Lack of recognition or recognition. How, from your experience, how can identity play a role in bringing greater harmony and consensus in that region? Over to you.
Colette, you need to unblock
Is that
your
okay now? Okay. So first of all, thank you for this opportunity. Even though I came in at the last moment, I think it is really important. And listening to George, I thought, and George will see why, that we just celebrated in Israel a whole week of a Jewish holiday called Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is about the revolt of, at the beginning of the first century, of the Maccabees against the very mighty Greek Empire. At that point, the Greek Empire wanted to get the Jews to forget about their identity, to Hellenize, as we call it. And the revolt really was more than anything not against the authority of Greece, but against the attempt to change the Jewish identity. And in fact, if you look at it closely, this is the history of the Jewish people, because over the years, the Jewish people wanted to keep their identity, not to become Christian, and most of the persecutions that they underwent, whether in Europe or elsewhere, had to do with the fact that they wanted to be different, that they decided not to convert and to maintain their identity. And so I think that when you are Jewish, you immediately understand one thing, and that is something that I've dealt with for many years, the right to be different, which is not really usually recognized. Now, about myself, as you mentioned, I also am a person with multiple identities, but I think that identities are also a history of transformations, of passages that we have. I was born in Romania during the Second World War, so first identity was one of a person running away from the Nazis. Second identity was Romanian, but with a French background, going only to French schools. So I do not know if I ever had a Romanian identity. Then I came to Israel, interestingly enough, and those are many, I think, Laura talked about the question of migrations and how one changes identity. I resisted changing identity. I didn't want to be an Israeli. I didn't want to learn Hebrew. So it took a long time before I decided to become an Israeli and before I felt fully an Israeli. And interestingly, years later, I went on mission to Romania to sign or to negotiate, as I was in the foreign ministry, to negotiate a cultural agreement. And when I landed in Romania, I felt absolutely nothing. I felt as a complete stranger. So you forget certain identities, you adopt other identities, you adapt to other identities. And then my problem was also not a problem, but my feminine identity. I started working in a milieu in the foreign ministry, which was largely a man's world, where women were not really taken seriously, where the idea that I might follow a diplomatic career or be once an ambassador was considered completely crazy, even though at that time Golda Meir, a woman, was the foreign minister. I was told point blank that a woman cannot be an ambassador or be a diplomat because we're hysterical. And so I discovered my feminism without even knowing that this is what it is called. I fought for women's rights, for my right to pursue a career and for other women, and open the doors to other women to follow that career as well. And then at one point I became a politician and I had to adopt again another kind of identity. But before I say that, I would like to say a few things about how I started thinking about identities. My first post was in Canada, in the midst of the conflict between the French Canadians and the English Canadians. And I do recall how the French Canadians, since I spoke French, would explain to me that they feel exactly like Israelis. You Israelis live in the midst of a sea of Arab countries and you're different. And we French Canadians have our identity. We're French in a sea and an English-speaking world. And I think that when you speak of identity, language, and we didn't discuss that, language has a very large role to play. How we understand language and how we use language and how much language is important to us. And then at another point in my life as a diplomat, when I served in Boston, I was fortunate enough to take some courses at Harvard, and one course that shaped my horizons and changed me so much and changed my understanding was one about conflict resolution, where I learned what identities are, what empathy is, what narratives are. And those were days, and I have to mix in politics to a certain extent, as George did. Those were days when for years and years, we kept on saying that there's no such a thing as a Palestinian people. We lived in complete denial. It was not only a ploy, we believed in it. And I remember being once at a meeting with Golda Meir when she spoke in front of students at the Hebrew University. And she said, there is no such thing. There are no Palestinians. I am a Palestinian. And what was she referring to? That before our independence and when we were under the British mandate, we were called Palestine and she had a Palestinian passport. So Palestinians didn't exist for us. We were in complete denial. We thought that they are inventing an identity just to fight against us. So it took a long time, certainly that course at Harvard, to understand what identity and that there is a Palestinian identity and how do you resolve conflicts and how exactly conflicts are being built around those identities and around those narratives. So those are some of the things which I wanted to say. I have become another identity of mine, probably like George, is that I'm a social democrat. And that shapes me also very much. I believe in the values and that social democracy promotes. I am also recently have become an author. because I have published a book, and from time to time I'm publishing many articles. And this is as much as my identity goes. And I assume that we'll have another round, and then we'll be able to speak about other aspects. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Colette. Now, let's go to Gabrielle, who's going to provide an overview of the concept of convivencia as a new cultural approach for identity relations. Over to you, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Jafar. Thank you very much. I was fascinated to hear all these stories, and not just in terms of what the different identities that came out, but also the kind of relationships that already we can see. Because the next part of our conversation is now that we understand, we all understand that identities are a complex matter, that we have to approach it without forgetting its complexity and so on. But what do we do? What do we do in terms of relationship? What kind of traits a narrative, a new culture, and a renewed culture on identity can look like, so we can, on the one hand, save the identity, save the character, the spirit of identity, the authenticity, the uniqueness, and on the other hand, not do that at the cost of coexistence, right? So in terms of the work of the foundation that I represent, we ask this question constantly, and we see, for example, the fact that identities either enter into relations through conflict or through the idea that in order to surpass conflict, in order to get rid of the conflict, you need to get rid of identity altogether. And this is a limited way to look at identity. We can perhaps instead focus on what George has mentioned, and which is the dignity of identities. Identities need not to be put into conflict, nor to be surpassed, but they need to be celebrated or cherished in terms of the dignity and the unicity, the fact that they're unique of their very nature. And this celebration of the dignity allows us to not just celebrate as some political forces and political views want us to do. I mean, the idea of celebrating the dignity is very much per se polarizing. If I only celebrate the dignity of my identity, regardless of the one of the other, then it's pointless in terms of surpassing the conflict. But if I am strong enough in the understanding of my identities, if I'm strong enough in the understanding of the dignity of these identities, and therefore I'm strong enough in the celebration, in taking pride of who I am and the many things, and constantly do this work of understanding and cherishing of what I am, then I'm able to do that with the others. I'm able to understand that this dignity is reflected also in the identity of you, Jafar, George, Laura, Colette, Shirin, and everybody who is following us. So in a relationship of reciprocity. And among the many identities that we don't have in common, there is definitely one that we do have in common, and that is the belonging to the human species. Now that the identity is, I'm not saying this is the most important one, nor this is the only one we have, because that would be flattening out all the other identities. If we start saying, oh, we are all humans, then there is no difference anymore. Then we are again at the beginning, we're at the beginning point. So we are humans and we are many other things. So these three characters of dignity and the cherishing and celebration of this dignity, the recognition of the reciprocity, and the encompassing element of the identity that for sure we have in common, the humanism and the humanity, make up for what we call, and George has mentioned, what we call convivencia, that comes from the Latin and from the Spanish convivere, to live together, to live along each other, which is an attempt to create this non-confrontational narrative and culture that allows us to move beyond the idea of conflict and without losing the specificity and the dignity and the living and embodiment of the identities. So, and this is just one idea. I'm throwing this idea out to you and to the whole public, but there may be many ideas, there may be many traits, there may be many ways to approach this question. The question remains, how do we create a condition for maintaining the identities and preserving coexistence of identities? This is the question, and one that I'm throwing at you, panelists, and Jafar, and all of us, for the next phase of the conversation, trying to understand what traits does a non-confrontational narrative and culture on identity have? What does it look like? And I'm not going to call on anybody who wants to intervene. Just go ahead, take the mic, and do it. We have time to dig into this together.
I'll start off. It's and I'll start off from the perspective of a conflict resolution professional, because often we have to balance one's needs with the other person's, needs. And so I think there are really 5 traits that we think are important. And I think the first one is self-reflection. You have a role in the conflict to be able to look inwardly and figure out what is your role, how did you contribute to the conflict? Another, conflict stirs up emotions. So you have to be able to manage your emotional triggers. Being aware of what emotions are generated by a particular situation without having those emotions control your behavior. So again, it's a little bit of self-reflection. And then dealing with conflict requires courage. And you have to take some risks in your interactions. Sometimes doing nothing seems like maybe the safest road, but often the best solutions involve taking some kind of risk, stepping out of your comfort zone. Fourth, nourishing or nurturing empathy by listening to understand. Often in a conflict, you listen to refute or to right away come back and say, I don't agree, because you're entrenched in your particular position. But when we listen to understand, we gain insights into the needs and interests of others. It's a critical feature in nurturing empathy by realizing the cognitive and emotional perspective of others. And then finally, I think, to George's point, which is very critical for us, acknowledging the dignity of others while asserting what is important to us. The 4 points that I've talked about, self-reflection, managing emotional triggers, cultivating courage, and nurturing empathy, allow us to acknowledge the dignity of others, to make them feel valued and validated, without losing what's important to us, even in the face of a strong disagreements or outright conflicts. And I think if we think about these traits, it will help us, or it helps us in resolving conflict on a more informal basis. I will stop there.
Maybe I'll come in and try to just bring a few thoughts to this discussion. First of all, I think that the problem is not creating a new narrative. The problem is accepting the narrative of the other, even if we don't agree to it. And I'll just bring in for a minute the Arab-Israeli or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We believe and they're proofs that we once lived in this country, that was our country, that we were dispossessed, that we were sent away, and that we came back to our land. The Palestinians, on the other hand, see in us a strange body that does not belong to this area. They think that we have dispossessed them. And if we celebrate 1948 as the day of our rebirth, of our independence, the Palestinians believe that 15th of May 1948 is what they call the Nakba, the day of their catastrophe. Obviously, this is a huge conflict, and as long as we're not be able to face each other and try to see how each other understands their history and what the real solution is, we cannot pass over. So we need sometimes different narratives have to be confronted to each other, discussed, but we cannot change the narrative of another person. We have to be able to accept it. And here, I think the notion of listening, of empathy is extremely important. I think that as long as we will not be able to accept the Palestinian narrative, and they will not be able to accept us as a people, but only as a religion, we will not really be able to solve this conflict. It's not about territory. So I'm bringing this, I think, as an example where it is important to accept the other identity. It is important not to try to change it. It is important to understand where it comes from. It is important to try to put together even two conflicting narratives and see that somehow, if we respect each other, we can bridge some of the gaps. This is one of the things which I wanted to say. Another thing is I owe a deep debt of gratitude to my passage in New York. Years ago, I was the Consul General in New York, and at that point, I started learning what at that time was called multiculturalism. You are not just an Irish person, you're an American Irish, you are an African American, you're a Jewish American, meaning that each one of those communities in countries like America and Israel, by the way, that tried to create the melting point, the ideal American, the ideal Israeli with blonde hair and speaking fluently Hebrew. That did not work in Israel. It did not work in America. In America, I think that they have the idea to call people Latino American, African American, Irish American, Jewish American means that you accept a priori that people can live in two cultures, in two identities. And so this is one of the things that I believe has to be inculcated. Another thing which can lead us to this kind of convivencia is to fight against their stereotypes. I think, and if I look at myself, I'm sure that even I have stereotypes. There's no doubt in my mind that I look at certain groups of people and judge them in a manner which is not proper, which belongs to stereotypes. And again, I'm bringing in the fact that I'm Jewish and that there's anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is based on stereotypes that have been passed on from one generation to the other. And unless we are capable of fighting and against those stereotypes and not putting on a whole people the fact that everybody is either a criminal or a thief or whatever, the way we see certain groups of people, that I think is one of the things that has to be instilled from a very young age in the educational system. And I think the only way to reach some kind of capability, not only to live in convivencia, but to be able to understand that others enrich us, that if I learn about another group of people, that if I learn the Greek culture or if I learn the African American culture, which I did, by the way, it is something which I cherish, something which has enriched me, something if I listen to a gospel or if I listen to a Greek song, it is important to me. I vibrate with it. I've learned that culture. I understand that culture. There's no way that I cannot live in convivencia with those people anymore. So I think we can create those cultural bridges, but I think that it has to come at an early age, and multicultural or multi-ethnic or multi-language schools are one place where this, I think, can be done, but not only there.
Maybe it's a good moment for me to jump in now, because I was exactly going to talk a little bit about that. I think what Shireen and Colette have mentioned is quite important, and I really like the 5 steps that Shireen mentioned for conflict resolution. But I do believe that we have to, in order to change a little bit this confrontational logic of identities, we need to look a little bit at the educational systems that we have. Unfortunately, because identities are created mainly when you are small children, and you develop your identity very much at that time, then it obviously changes through the years, but there are some very deep values and beliefs that you develop at those ages. And if you get it wrong then, it is very difficult to get it right after. So I think that really looking at the educational system in a different manner is going to be crucial if we really want to move from that confrontational logic. I was reading very much and liking very much a new book the other day that is called the School of Life of Alain de Botton. And he has a very interesting logic, saying that basically we are teaching children the wrong thing. We are teaching people, technical or professional things that today actually we can all find in the internet. And we are not teaching people how to live and how to relate to others. And that should be a little bit the basic of our education. And really understanding our own emotions, understanding our own logics and the emotions of our, the circle around us, our parents, our brothers and sisters. I think it is extremely important. And this is part eventually of what can help us to really create and educate people that are more open, that don't necessarily identify with one single identity, but realize that there are multiple identities that they indeed use in different moments in different ways, and that there is a beauty on that. And that is actually, that diversity is what makes us human beings and what makes us capable of relating with totally different people around the world. And that very often we share one of those identities with somebody. In my experience, I have never met anybody that I really don't share anything. I have met now 3 people in this panel, and I lived in Greece for 3 years. I speak Greek. George Papandreou was the prime minister a little bit after, so I know him perfectly well. Shireen works with the UN. Colette was an ambassador as I was an ambassador, a diplomat. So the reality is that it is extremely difficult not to find commonalities with people, but the problem is that our educational systems, and particularly George was saying that, particularly the way that we teach history is us against the others. I used to have a Greek husband, and I know the story of the Balkans in a certain way, and then suddenly now I have a Bulgarian husband, and I am learning the history of the Balkans totally different. It's actually quite the opposite to the one that I learned before. So you realize there that if we were teaching children things in a different manner, we can create different societies. And I think that that element is going to be extremely important. And as long as we don't understand that and we keep having the education systems that we have, we are moving towards separation and not coming together. Over.
Maybe I could just add, Jafar, a few things. First of all, I agree very much with what has been said, and I also like the 5 traits Shireen has talked about. I've thought a lot about the educational system as I was Minister of Education, but not only that, I lived in 4 different countries and 8 different schools from K to 12. So I really felt different educational systems. And I think education is crucial, lifelong education, of course, but at the younger age, crucial to be able to, first of all, be open to discuss multiple identities, to discuss these issues, and give a sense, create an atmosphere, which should be not only in the school, but in society, but in schools, if we want to talk about an ideal type school, which is with an ecosystem of a school which allows for the self-confidence and self-reflection, as Shireen was saying, but also dignity towards the other, and not trying to break down these stereotypes that we have. I think also what Laura was saying is we have been focusing too much on rote learning and technical skills or professional skills rather than building up citizenship. And citizenship should be learning to live in a community, learning to be active in a community, learning to communicate in a community, learning to work in a group, and respect and use and revel in this diversity. And in history, I think what we also need to do is to teach the conflict. We need to not simply say, this is my story and we are the heroes, but give the different sides, because then you give an understanding to the younger generation, but also to our citizens that there are conflicts, but it also humanizes. Maybe it demythologizes the conflict, and that maybe we can deal with conflict in a different way. And in a funny way, democracy in Greece. There's one theorist, a woman that says that Greeks read the Iliad. The Iliad is a story about a fight over a woman, a macho culture of killing each other, and heroes with blood and rape and so on. And that listening and reading this over and over and over again, there was an understanding that we need to find different ways of dealing with conflict, and that's where democracy sort of started building out of that. That this was a way to deal with conflict through peaceful means and respect of the other's view, and that each one has an equal voice. Well, democracy then was not full democracy, obviously, but the concept was there. I just wanted to, so I think that's one important thing that we need to do in our educational systems. One more, I would add to Shireen's 6th point, which from my understanding and my experience is important. When you do have a conflict or you have different identities, we can also find things where we can work together. And if we do something together, it could be as simple as, breaking bread, drinking wine, listening to music together, or it could be actually something much more profound. You show that this actually multiple identities can be very productive. I had an experience in our Greek-Turkish relations. I was actually able to build up trust with my counterpart, Ismail Cem, in Turkey. And we would think about, what can we do? What kind of initiatives can we do? And, we promoted people's diplomacy, citizens to citizens, local government to local government, women to women, football teams, basketball teams, and so on. But then we said, okay, since we are together, why don't we see if we can talk about some of the regional conflicts? And we worked together during the Kosovo conflict to work together to provide humanitarian aid. But then, Colette, you may remember at that time, there was a very, very tense situation between Israel and Arafat in Ramallah. And it was, Arafat was surrounded and they had been bombed and so on. And
He was in prison.
we decided, he was in prison basically, and we decided to visit both Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat. Now, Ariel Sharon was saying, if you visit Arafat, I will not see you. But we decided then to go together. And he said, well, since you're together, I cannot say no. So we actually visited both Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat together, a Greek minister with a Turkish minister. And that, of course, immediately showed that even though Greeks and Turks had their conflict, when we are together, we actually can do things quite amazing that nobody else can do. So I think we just add another sixth point there that, finding common things that we can do together can also bring about helpful ways to break down this conflictual spirit.
Go ahead, please.
Can I add something
of course.
to what George said? I would like to say that in the early 2000s, we had a very interesting experience of creating an international women's commission to try to work on convivencia and on solving the Arab-Israeli or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it was created under the umbrella of the United Nations. A third Israeli women, a third Palestinian women, a third international women. And the only man who was there was George Papandreou when we created that. So chapeau. It worked for a while, but then with the Intifada and with the difficulty of crossing borders, it petered and it finally ended. And I still believe that
we need to recreate it, Colette.
Exactly, absolutely.
And if I may enter here, because this is a little bit the point. No, I mean we have put this table together with people in position of leadership or who had position of leadership. This is called a thought leaders series, the one that the Staff College is doing on this of many topics. The question is, I mean, we heard very important steps. The one that Shirin has mentioned, the one that Colette was saying about accepting the narrative, Laura about education, and George some of the very empirical, very practical things that you were able to do. But again, we're on the spot, like very targeted to specific challenges, which is exactly what we need. The question is, how do we make actions in terms of policies, in terms of political agenda, if you wish, not necessarily of one party or the other, but in terms of political agendas, how do we make this systemic? How do we make sure that that kind of approach that George had with that intuition of working with the Turkish ministers it becomes a modus operandi, a way to work that is the normality and not just the exceptionality of the moment? Can we create a cultural framework, not just in schools, but in the action? I'm asking the leaders here. Can we do something from the policy and political point of view to do that? That's my question to you for the last 12 minutes of the conversation, as we're going to finish on time.
What is your question? I didn't understand.
The question is, how do we make that process not exceptional, but systemic and practical and the norm in terms of the way that we operate in terms of the leadership?
Only through education.
Yeah, I think the issue is, I think we are doing it. in a certain manner. We are all trying to do different things in that regard. But if you want to do something that is dramatically, transformational and much more systemic, then you have to deal with education, because that's the main problem. But specific ad hoc initiatives like the ones that we have described, I think there are plenty of them around the world. And the UN is a place where we constantly are looking at that, not only with regard to the UN inside the UN, but also with the beneficiaries around the world. I think the role that we have as an organization is to bring that diversity and to recognize that diversity and to, I would say, celebrate that diversity. But obviously there are a lot of things that we cannot do. We cannot do that in a systematic, transformational manner unless you attack the root causes of it, which I think again goes to education. Over.
I would tend to agree that education at a much younger age than people tend to think about. I mean, I think high school and college is too late. I thought, you start right away. But if I have a colleague who kind of has been wrestling with this sense of interdependence, which allows us to bring together what seemingly are inconsistent interests. And she was very profound in the way she describes the interdependence is the connectedness of all people and how your very existence relies and impacts on the existence of others. Recognize we all belong to the same human family, sharing the same fundamental human needs, that therefore what we do to another, we do to ourselves. And so if we think about it in that context of being all part of it, it's not a flattening. It's more recognition that what we're doing to another, we are really doing ourselves, because we're all part of the human family, sharing the same human needs.
Shireen, that reminds me that years ago, many years ago, there was an exhibition in the book called The Family of Man. And I think that if we could recreate that, including at the United Nations, that would be great.
And I would just add, if we could get our educational systems to provide this, but at the same time, I mentioned earlier, and I think I need to bring it back, that there are other issues that affect how we understand our identity. So the deep inequalities, if you have deep inequalities and someone feels excluded, or if there are deep injustices and someone again feels wronged, if there's a society with violence, these are issues, or not access to some basic needs. These are issues which will affect identities.
We don't hear you. We can't hear you, George.
Yes, now you can hear me. Okay, I think it's better, yeah.
Right.
So I would say, how do we bring the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, to maybe put them into our education system, but also maybe envelop them in this idea of convivencia, that these things, because what we are facing this huge common challenge in the world of climate crisis. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. But they are not just around climate, they are around many other social issues. If we could see that as a sort of a content which leads to a more convivial and symbiotic world, and use education as sort of our laboratory or our workshop for this, maybe that would be that would be an approach to help out in building up this concept of convivencia, because SDGs basically mean, we have to work together. Climate crisis means we have to work together. So that could be a driving force. It can also, if we don't do it, it can also become a one that divides us over resources, over refugees, over building walls because we think we're going to protect ourselves. But I think this is where we need to and this is a political fight too. It's not simply.
That's right.
It is a political fight.
We do need a global curriculum.
Yes.
And it could be very easily based on the SDGs, but a global curriculum, not just the international baccalaureate, in the high school, much younger, a global curriculum. It would change the world.
Yeah, I agree, Shireen. Very good idea. Let's do that.
All right, Gabi, you have the foundation.
We're here for that, but I wanted to hear a last comment from Laura before we wrap up and then pass the word to Jafar, because I know she wants to intervene.
Laura?
Yeah. Well, I think the only thing that I think nobody mentioned that I think is important is the fact that one thing is what you believe you are, and the other thing is what the others believe you are. And the identity, the element of identity is not only what you believe you are, but it's also the perception that the others have about you. And I think nobody touched on that element. And I very briefly, just to say, when I was 17 years old, I went to the US in a high school, and I went to the high school, and in the break, all the Black students came to talk to me. So when I arrived back in Costa Rica, I told my parents, I realized that I am not white. And they say, why? I said, because the white don't think that I am white. And that element, I think, is extremely important. Nobody touched on it, and I think is a key element because it creates also some contradictions about what you feel and what the others believe you feel.
Yeah. Well, I had similar experience, Laura, in Sweden. Yeah, when I was in Sweden, I had similar experience. But you're right. Very right.
I would like to point out to an Italian author by the name of Pirandello, who wrote about this subject, about the various identities, how I am, how I think I am, and how somebody else perceives me. And that's interesting, but and those may be conflicting. So the problem is to make sure that those are not conflicting.
And along the same lines, I mean, well, it's interesting what Laura and George just said, because there is always somebody who is whiter than you. There is always somebody that is more different that you think you are, right? So the point, I think that you touched on the fact that on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the SDGs, why, from my point of view, because that's the most encompassing policy agenda we have globally. And if you're able to do, as we say with the foundation, to allow people to wear the lenses of convivencia, to wear the lenses of this complexity and this understanding of the complexity of the identities and the relations, then they're going to be able to decline those within the specific aspects of policy of the 17 goals and many more. So yes, I think there is something there, and the foundation is here to help trigger that conversation and bring those ideas together. So thank you very much from my side for this. I leave the word to the host, Jafar, but just to say to all the panelists, everybody who followed us, and especially a big thank to Jafar and the Staff College for the opportunity to have this conversation and to start possibly, hopefully, something altogether.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you. Thank you all. I was enjoying this conversation so much that I was thinking, we can't end it. It's just that unfortunately, because of time limits and your busy schedule and we have to end it, but I can promise you that it's going to continue, hopefully in Turin. We would like to invite you when things are better. You can come here, we can have a dinner conversation and hopefully, get something very concrete out of it. I think there are a number of ideas that have come out of this conversation that are definitely worth really focusing on and to seeing that we just don't leave it at the conversation level, but we actually come up with very concrete action steps to sort of begin to really promote all these issues that you all have brought up. I think education and the role of learning has definitely come out on the top as something that we have to do. I think it's really important from the learning side that, to learn about other people's history and culture and where they're coming from, why they're taking positions on whatever position they're taking on. I think that helps to understand, respect, recognize, and create that environment where we as human beings, we can actually sit and talk to each other, resolve conflicts. So thank you all. This has been a wonderful, wonderful hour and a half. I hate to finish it, but I know you all have to go. I can stay, but I know you have to go. I have to also to tell you that the takeaways from today's discussion is going to definitely influence the work that we do in the area of diversity and inclusion, which are really a serious and integral part of our academic offerings here at the college. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Vittorio Dan Segre Foundation, for the collaboration and for making this event happen. I'm really, honestly, sincerely grateful to all of you, our panelists, for accepting our invitation and being part of this panel. Huge thanks. And big thanks to my colleagues who did actually work behind the scene to make all this thing happen. Thank you all. And finally, big thanks to our online viewers for watching, making sure to, please make sure to post your takeaways on social media using #UnityInDifference. And please tune in for our next Thought Leadership Series event coming in 2022 by visiting us at www.unssc.org. Please enjoy the rest of the day, stay well, and wishing you all a very healthy and wonderful and happy 2022. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Yasulora.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Grazie.
Colette,
tanto.
Shireen, Gabriele, grazie, Jafar, thank you.
Grazie, George.
Bye.
Thank you.